Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolutely epic story of how the Mauryan Empire forged a unified India out of what was, quite frankly, absolute chaos. I want you to imagine a vast, completely fractured subcontinent suddenly engineered into this incredibly advanced, centralized superpower over 2,000 years ago. It's mind-blowing. So let's unpack the blueprints of the Mauryan machine.
Before 321 BCE, the Indian subcontinent really wasn't a single entity at all. It was this fractured, highly vulnerable collection of regional states called Mahajanapadas. Because they were so divided, they were completely exposed to foreign incursions, like the Greek invasions. But the Mauryas? They completely rewrote reality. They stepped in and engineered the region's very first truly unified state, all backed up by a highly organized, tightly centralized administration.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, the first unified India. So how did it happen? Well, the dominoes fell with incredible speed. Back in 326 BC, Alexander the Great's campaign basically ripped the Band-Aid off, exposing massive political weaknesses in the northwest. Just 5 years later, a man named Chandragupta Maurya, guided by his brilliantly strategic advisor Kautilya, seized that exact moment. He overthrew the reigning Nanda dynasty and grabbed the reins of power. And get this, by 305 BCE, he wasn't just defending, he was actively defeating Alexander's successors and pushing his borders deep into modern-day Afghanistan.
Moving on to part two, architects of the empire. Let's look at the minds behind this operation.
This massive state wasn't an overnight job. It was actually built over 3 consecutive, highly effective generations. We start with the founder, Chandragupta, who laid the groundwork. He then passed the throne to his son, Bindusara, and Bindusara pushed those borders all the way south into the Deccan Plateau. Finally, we reach Ashoka. Now, Ashoka is widely considered the absolute greatest Mauryan ruler. He's the one who brought the empire to its absolute zenith, stretching all the way from the Hindu Kush right down to the southern peninsula.
Now, you might be wondering, how do we know so much about how this machine actually worked? We have 2 absolutely stunning primary sources to thank for that. From the inside, we have the Arthashastra, written by Kautilya. Think of it as the ultimate ancient playbook for taxation, statecraft, and yes, even espionage. Then, from the outside looking in, we have the Indica. That was written by a Greek ambassador named Megasthenes, and he gives us these incredible boots-on-the-ground details about Mauryan society and their spectacular capital city.
Which brings us to a major pivot in the story. Part 3, the Kalinga War and Dhamma.
The empire's most dramatic turning point wasn't some clever political treaty, it was a devastating conflict in 261 BCE. Ashoka wanted to control the eastern coast, so he initiated the Kalinga War. And the human cost here was just staggering. Literally hundreds of thousands of people killed or deported. Seeing that sheer scale of destruction firsthand, it triggered a massive existential crisis for the conqueror. It completely broke him.
Deeply traumatized by all that bloodshed, Ashoka underwent a profound personal transformation. He adopted Buddhism, sure, but for the state itself, he rolled out a revolutionary concept called Dhamma. Now, Dhamma wasn't exactly a religion. It was more of a broad policy of moral law and ethical conduct. It was a complete 180-degree pivot from conquest by the sword to conquest by morality.
In actual practice, Dhamma was a genius blueprint for social harmony. It pushed for nonviolence toward all living things, deep respect for elders, and, this is absolutely crucial for an empire that diverse, strict religious tolerance. Ashoka even backed all this up with state-sponsored welfare measures. He actually appointed special officials called Dhamma Mahamatras, basically ancient morality officers, who traveled all over the empire just to ensure these principles were being followed on the ground.
Which leads us to a really fascinating question, one historians still argue about. Was Ashoka's Dhamma purely the spiritual and moral awakening of a guilt-ridden king? Or was it the ultimate calculated political strategy? Think about it for a second. How do you keep a vast, culturally diverse, and massive population united without completely bankrupting your state through constant military suppression? Promoting a universal code of ethics, unity, and social harmony? That might just be the most brilliant administrative tool ever invented.
All right, let's look under the hood. Part 4, running the Mauryan machine.
To manage a population of that massive size day to day, the administration operated as a pretty ruthless top-down hierarchy. You had the supreme king sitting at the very top, holding ultimate military and executive authority. The empire was then carved up into provinces, usually governed by royal princes. Below them, you had district officials sweating the nitty-gritty details of revenue and law, all the way down to the very foundation of the empire, the local village, managed by a headman called the Gramaka. But here's the thing. You definitely don't hold a massive top-down structure like that together on trust alone. Not a chance. Kautilya's Arthashastra outlined what was essentially an ancient CIA. It was a staggeringly extensive spy network. These spies were constantly monitoring state officials for corruption, quietly gauging the mood of the general public, and fiercely protecting the throne from the shadows.
And of course, they backed up that invisible intelligence with absolute terrifying muscle. The Mauryan military was one of the largest in the ancient world. They fielded a massive infantry, supported by cavalry, rapid war chariots, and, the real heavy hitters, divisions of war elephants. And it wasn't just some disorganized mob. It was a highly organized war machine managed by dedicated military committees that were always ready to deploy.
Now all of this, the bureaucrats, the spies, those incredibly expensive war elephants, had to be funded somehow, right? The state achieved this by taxing agricultural produce at roughly 1/6. But trade was the real economic engine here. The empire provided essential security along major superhighways, like the famous Uttarapatha Road. Trade absolutely boomed using uniform punch-marked coins, and it was driven by powerful merchant guilds known as shrinis. These guilds were so influential they even acted as early banks to keep the empire's cash flowing smoothly.
So how does a machine like that ever break down? Let's explore Part 5, the fall and legacy. Before it eventually fractured, the empire left a literally indelible mark on the landscape, basically kickstarting the era of monumental stone architecture in India. They gave us the original Sanchi Stupa, the impossibly smooth, polished interiors of the Barabar caves, and, of course, Ashoka's famous rock and pillar edicts. These were massive, monolithic sandstone pillars raised across the entire subcontinent, just to broadcast his messages in stone for all to see.
And the empire's impact is still highly visible today. In fact, one of those specific pillar capitals, the Sarnath lion capital, featuring 4 lions standing over the wheel of law, is quite literally the national emblem of modern India. So the visual identity of a billion-person democracy today is directly rooted in ancient Mauryan statecraft. How amazing is that?
Yet despite this glorious legacy and their incredibly advanced administration, the empire just couldn't sustain itself forever. The decline was driven by a few highly critical factors. First off, the successors who came after Ashoka, well, they simply lacked his capability and his vision. Second, the massive financial burden of maintaining that enormous army and vast bureaucracy became just way too heavy. And finally, as that central authority weakened, local governors out in the provinces seized the opportunity to revolt, gradually fragmenting the state back into pieces.
And honestly, the timeline of unity snapped shockingly fast. After Ashoka died around 232 BCE, the empire immediately began to hemorrhage territory. The absolute final blow came in 185 BCE. That's when the very last Mauryan ruler, Prahadratha, was violently assassinated by his own military commander. With that single sword stroke, the great Mauryan dynasty was definitively over. As we wrap up this explainer, we can clearly see how the Mauryas laid the true foundations for centralized administration, economic integration, and ethical governance in the region. But it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. If the Mauryas could effectively unify a massive, diverse subcontinent using strategic diplomacy, a shadow intelligence agency, and moral messaging carved into stone pillars over 2,000 years ago, what essential elements of Kautilya's ancient bureaucratic playbook are modern politicians and governments still secretly relying on right now? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and remember,